Welcome to all participants who are joining us for this exciting webinar on recognizing biodiversity as a public good. My name is Dr. Phaedra Henley, and I'm an assistant professor and the chair of the Center for One Health at the University of Global Health Equity, and I'm so excited to be hosting this session. In honor of the United Nations International Day for Biological Diversity, we will be hearing from experts from diverse backgrounds and experiences who will share evidence of the impact of climate change and pollution, among other threats, on biodiversity and human life, and discuss the preventative practices, policies, and lessons learned in fighting for our ecosystem. Many of the global health challenges we face cross disciplines and borders, lie at the animal-human environment interface, and require collaborative efforts to effectively address them. The One Health approach recognizes the links between the health of humans, animals, and their shared environment. It differs from other approaches to health as it considers the integrative effort of multiple disciplines and sectors working together to achieve evidence-based and community-placed solutions to complex health challenges. Recognizing the importance of One Health, the University of Global Health Equity started a Center for One Health. Here, the center integrates One Health throughout all curricula, such as in medicine, and implements a master's degree in One Health. We have a growing research program with current projects on neglected tropical diseases and COVID-19. The focus of the center is more crucial than ever before, with a continued threat of COVID-19 mandating new knowledge and action and requiring innovative solutions to effectively respond to challenges. With a realization that complex global challenges such as the loss of biodiversity will disproportionately impact low to middle income countries, Africa is emerging as a global leader in One Health, and we at the Center for One Health aim to lead the way. The Center is honored to be hosting this conversation and to have our esteemed panelists here to share the important message of connectivity between the loss of biodiversity, human health, and social justice. I would now like to introduce our panelists who come from all over the world, but who share the same passion for protecting our ecosystems. First is Dr. Mary Robinson, who is an adjunct professor of climate justice at Trinity College Dublin and the chair of elders. She served as the President of Ireland from 1990 to 97 and the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights from 97 to 2002. She's a member of the Club of Madrid and the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom from former President of the United States, Barack Obama. Dr. Robinson's memoir, Everybody Matters, was published in 2012, and her book, Climate Justice, Hope, Resilience, and the Fight for a Sustainable Future, was published in 2018. Next we have is Dr. Elvis Paul Tangam, who is the coordinator for the Great Green Wall for the Sahara and Sahel Initiative for the African Union Commission. He is a sustainable development, biodiversity conservation, climate change, and value chain development professional with over 18 years of experience in the UK, Africa, and Asia. Dr. Tangam has experience with various national and international development organizations, and has also initiated and been a pioneer member of several initiatives, including the Cameroon Traditional Rulers Against Climate. Next, we have Kate Harridan, who is a Wiradjuri woman doing a PhD at the Australian National University, investigating Indigenous water science's potential to improve urban quality outcomes. Her research as a visiting Indigenous Fellow at ANU's Center for Aboriginal Economic Policy Research actively incorporates Indigenous pedagogy in undergraduate teaching. Co-founder of the Fenner Research and Teaching Decolonizing Circle, her research philosophy is that research must be practical, knowledge is for sharing, and that expertise is not held only by experts. Last, we have Dr. Philip Landrigan, who's a pediatrician and epidemiologist. He directs the Global Observatory on Pollution and Health in Boston College. His research examines the impacts of children's health of toxic environmental hazards and has shaped national and global policy and prevented disease and premature death in millions. Dr. Landrigan co-chaired the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health, which reported that pollution causes 9 million deaths annually and that pollution prevention is feasible and highly cost-effective. Since 2019, he has led the Monaco Commission on Human Health and Ocean Pollution. I'm so excited to hear from our panelists and share this important and timely discussion. I would now like to turn it over to Professor Agnes Benawajo, Professor and Vice Chancellor of the University of Global Health Equity and the chair for our session. Thank you.
Thank you, Phaedra, for this wonderful welcome. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, whatever place you are in the world. I'm delighted to also welcome everyone from around the world for this timely webinar. This webinar is timely because remember, the UN Convention Biological Diversity was ratified in 1992 by many countries, and since then, deforestation has destroyed a quarter of the tropical forest of that time. Furthermore, we also have evidence today that none of the targets of the strategic plan for biodiversity for 2011-2020 have been totally met. The great global health and climate justice fighter we have the chance to hear from today on our panel will provide details of all this for 4 specific regions of the globe. They will also provide solutions to stop and reverse the trend of the loss of biodiversity with contextual local and global specific strategies. We are grateful for our wonderful panelists for joining us today to share their knowledge and expertise. Before starting, we have some logistical information. For people who are hard of hearing, please access the closed captioning function on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please click on the closed captioning CC button to benefit from the real-time text translation. And for people with visual impairment, we have take care about that by asking the participant to be very descriptive in any image of their slide. In this month of May, the United Nations commemorate the International Day for Biological Diversity. The foundation of biodiversity is explained by life on Earth, the diverse species and ecosystems that make up the biosphere, as well as its habitat, environment, or place in which they exist. The theme of 2021 of the day is "We are part of the solution for nature." And the international community is urged to stand in solidarity for the adoption of a new global biodiversity framework that will address climate, health issues, food, and water security to ensure sustainable livelihood, of which biodiversity is a foundational aspect. As humans, we are dependent of the biosphere, and we must recognize the value and needs of all its species, not only human, because they are all providing us with what is essential for our everyday functioning. We all know that the global issues we face are linked to biodiversity, and it is time to recognize that biodiversity decline requires urgent global and local multi-sectorial action to halt and reverse it. This is essential to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal, and we have less than 10 years to make it a reality. In addition to all this, climate change directly affects species habitat, leading to their death, provoking a spread of new pathogens, such as what we are facing now, the coronavirus that is causing the current COVID-19 pandemic. Moreover, the poorly managed response to the pandemic further increased environmental threat that we as humans have put on the biosphere. An example is the horrific ocean pollution, with PPE waste, such as single mask use, gloves, and other personal protective equipment. The accumulation of this waste over time is a cause for increased negative environmental footprint due to increased CO2 emission. We can also see the damaging effect of on biodiversity loss through the comorbidity of environmental threats such as tornado, hurricane, monsoons that are increasing. Here in my region, last month we saw hurricane in Tanzania. And when I asked around me, all the elders, they told me that we never seen that before. And there is even no terms for this weather threat in our local languages. We have also seen in Oceania, last year, the wildlife and forests of Australia destroyed by wildfire, displacing nearly 3 billion animals and worsening air pollution. And in North America, we have seen the fast drawns of Colorado River as a sign of water degradation in rivers and lakes due to pollution, poorly sustainable farming, and human overuse. In the northern region of the globe, since humans arrived there at Iceland, over 95% of these forests have been lost due to deforestation. This causes climate change, and technique used for deforestation destroys vegetation and cause an increase of emission of CO2 in the biosphere. In Asia, where some of the most species-rich areas are on Earth, we have seen one of the largest extinction rates by habitat loss due, for example, to deforestation for luxury furniture for rich countries, or commerce for goods such as palm oil. And all this without effort to conserve biodiversity. And the lack of conservation is due to the fact that rich countries, the G7, that benefit from those destruction don't contribute to the region conservation activities. And many developing countries do not have the means to bear the cost of conservation and restoration. With this example, you can see that all the planet is concerned by the threats we are doing as human. We have mistreated the nature to the point where it may no longer provide us the protection and service needed to sustain our healthy living. Today, the Earth is losing biodiversity at a rate never seen since 66 million years. And there is a accumulating evidence that we are approaching the Earth's next mass extinction created by us and of which we will all suffer from, putting the most vulnerable at the front line of suffering. Overall, it is not only our physical health that is at risk, but also our tradition, our spirituality, our cultural diversity, our psychological well-being, our artistic aspiration, and I can go on. So this afternoon, this morning, or this evening, whatever place we are in the world, let's discuss with our wonderful panelists what the situation is in their region or in their sphere of work and what proposed solution they have. But before driving into the discussion, let me begin by asking each of you, of our panelists, to give their introductory remark. Join me in giving a warm welcome to Mary Robinson. Mary Robinson will be sharing with us today climate justice and biodiversity.
Happy to join in marking the International Day for Biological Diversity by accepting the invitation of my good friend, Agnes Benagwaho, to join this webinar. I want to focus on the role that women leaders and women frontline voices can make in creating a greater sense of urgency about the need to protect our biodiversity and indeed plan better to restore it. Let me draw on the experience of the climate COPs, which when I attended my first conference on climate in Copenhagen in 2009, I was shocked at the lack of any focus on gender or indeed human rights. And the following year at the conference in Mexico in Cancun, a number of us as women leaders formed a network of women leaders on gender and climate. Patricia Espinosa, who's now executive secretary of the COP, was one of those leaders, as was Connie Hedegaard, who had presided over Copenhagen, and Mighty Mashaban, who was about to preside over the next conference in Durban in South Africa. We decided that we needed women ministers of environment and heads of agencies to participate, because they would determine the policy, and that would help the women's constituency, which had been trying to get a gender action plan, but just had not been able to get it to have the priority it deserved. But with women ministers, things changed, and we planned for gender parity first, and then to support a full-scale gender action plan. That was the first step of women leaders on the climate side. The next one was a recognition of the importance of encouraging the voices of grassroots women, indigenous women, young women. And these women were at the heads of their delegations, so they could determine who would be in the delegation with full delegate badge. And that, of course, meant that they were at the right table, not in the very vibrant civil society forum, which is always very active. The delegates don't tend to go there. So once you are you have a full delegate badge, you are at the table. And particularly when I became special envoy for the Secretary General on climate before the Paris Agreement, I saw the difference it made. I saw, first of all, that women leaders were really playing a role, but I also saw the voices. It made such a difference in the room, because the delegates were mainly from cities, and they worried about the phrases and the commas and the text, whereas these women spoke from the heart about the existential threat they were coping with, how they were making their communities resilient, and it really, really made a difference. So we need the same opportunity for women's voices in the other conference. And remember, we have both conferences this year. We have COP26 in Glasgow on climate, but we also have COP15 in Kunming in China in October. And I'm glad to say that we had a meeting recently of the relatively newly formed Africa-Europe Women Leaders Network, which is co-chaired by Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf and myself, on biodiversity. And it was important because we spoke of the linkages between the biodiversity conservation and restoration and the climate crisis. Really, the linkages are huge. It's the same sides of the coin. And Elizabeth Marema, who's executive secretary, head of the preparations for Kunming and COP15, she reminded us of the priorities of that COP, and that 80% of smallholder farmers globally are women. So women need to be at every table. She spoke of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and also that there is now a gender action plan in that, which is very welcome. And how often have we heard this mentioned in discussions about the climate crisis? And yet they're two sides of the one coin. So I'm calling on women leaders. Let's be holistic in our approach. Let's not just talk about the urgency of the climate crisis. Let's talk about biodiversity restoration and conservation in the same context. Let's talk about nature-based solutions. Issues like tree planting and switching to clean cooking are vital for both conferences. And some of the best examples of nature-based solutions are in the hands of local communities. So we need to develop community-based approaches to both conferences, to the climate issue, that it really starts at the community and works upwards. And we need the bottom up and the top down of responsibility, and the same thing for biodiversity. And so I look forward very much to the question and answer, because I feel very strongly that women can give the kind of leadership, and it's women at all levels. It's also women at local community level, indigenous women, young women, grassroots women. And we have to take the leadership on behalf of humanity, and we have to lead in both conferences, in both issues, because, as I said, they are the same sides of the same coin. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Mary, for your insightful presentation. You have shown us that the way forward can only be done if we include all representatives of society in a multi-sectorial way with a regional and global approach, with specific interests for women, children, youth, and minorities. But before all, we need solidarity and support for creating new green approaches for developing countries to extract their people out of poverty without suffering the inequity of not being able to develop their economy. So, and I advise all to follow the podcast of Mary is leading, and also awareness of all of us. See my badges here. It comes from Mary Action for the angry grannies, grandma. I'm a grandma, proud grandma for social justice. Our second panelist is Philip Landrigan. Phil will share with us his view on how to preserve biodiversity and how this protects human health, discussing the data on the situation of biodiversity in the US. The floor is yours, Phil.
Well, good day. My name is Dr. Philip Landrigan. I'm a pediatrician and an epidemiologist. I direct the program for global public health and the common good at Boston College in the United States. Today, I'd like to talk about how preserving biodiversity protects human health. So the most unique feature of Earth is the existence of life. And the most extraordinary feature of life is its amazing diversity. There's something like an estimated 8 to 9 million species that call this Earth their home. And as the consequence of short-sighted human action, as many as 1 million of these species could be made extinct within the next few decades. I want to talk about how biodiversity benefits human health and make the point that biodiversity is not something remote and far away, but something that affects all of us in our daily lives. How does biodiversity benefit human health? Well, firstly, we would not have oxygen to breathe if it were not for diverse ecosystems, because it is marine microorganisms in the oceans and healthy, diverse forests on land that produce the oxygen that is essential for all life on Earth. Biodiverse ecosystems purify the water we drink. Upland forests, for example, hold water and regulate flows. Wetlands and estuaries purify the water and allow it to sediment. Most of the food we eat is formed from soil, and without healthy microbial ecosystems in soil, it would not be possible to grow plants and produce diverse foodstuffs, nor would it be possible to pollinate these plants. Diverse ecosystems in the oceans provide seafood, which is the primary source of protein for approximately 3 billion people on the planet. Diverse ecosystems stabilize the global climate. They sequester carbon, they cool the Earth's surface, they protect against floods. Diverse, balanced ecosystems protect us against infectious diseases by preventing the escape of dangerous pathogens from wild places into the environs of human beings. Ecosystems provide medicines and essential nutrients. For example, the quinine that cures malaria, the iodine from the ocean that prevents thyroid disease. Ecosystems provide fascinating and unique models for the study of physiology and disease. Diverse, beautiful ecosystems create beauty and peace, and serenity and tranquility on the Earth, which in turn benefit mental health and enable spiritual well-being. And diverse ecosystems have enormous economic benefits. An estimated 2/3 of the global economy depends directly or indirectly on products and services made possible by ecosystems. So how does loss of biodiversity harm human health? The answer is in many ways, and I'll list some of them here. Firstly, loss of biodiversity and deforestation result in degradation of air quality. Very important because air pollution is the largest environmental cause of death in the world, responsible for approximately 7 million premature deaths each year. Secondly, loss of biodiversity, loss of forests and wetlands results in scarcity of fresh drinkable water. Uh, the heavy use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides diminishes the biodiversity of the soil. That reduces fertility and results in the production of less food, poor quality food, which in turn lead to malnutrition and famine. Loss of pollinators further reduces food production, results in crop failure and famine. Pollinators are killed by insecticides, especially we think the neonicotinoid insecticides, which are increasingly used. Loss of marine biodiversity in the oceans results in declining fish stocks. That results in famine and malnutrition among people on the coasts in island communities who depend heavily upon the sea for their food. Because the environment and biodiversity in the environment play an important role in stabilizing the climate, the loss of biodiversity results in climate destabilization with increased frequency of floods and droughts, wildfires, and extreme weather events. Loss of biodiversity enables certain species that are very competent hosts that effectively can transmit infections from wild species to humans. It allows these competent hosts to proliferate and results in the expansion of diseases like Ebola, West Nile virus, hantavirus, and most recently, of course, COVID-19. The World Health Organization estimates that about 4 billion people around the world depend on natural medicines, and loss of biodiversity reduces access to those key medicines. Loss of biodiversity results in loss of all the recreational and cultural and spiritual benefits that healthy, diverse environments convey to humans. And it results in economic losses. It results in displacement of people, forced migration, and conflict. So how do we fix this? How do we correct this situation? Well, I think we have to begin by recognizing that loss of biodiversity, climate change, pollution, and all the other existential threats that confront humanity today have a common origin, and that common origin is a linear economic model, short-term thinking, focused entirely on short-term gains. What some of the economists have termed a take, make, use, dispose economy, what Pope Francis has called a throwaway culture. This is an approach to the world that focuses entirely on today, takes no heed for the future, treats the world's resources as though they were inexhaustible, and basically mortgages humanity's future. And to preserve biodiversity and protect human health and preserve our common home, we have to get beyond that. We have to move to a more circular way of thinking. One specific action we need to take as quickly as possible is to transition rapidly from fossil fuels to clean, renewable energy, by which I mean wind and solar, geothermal, hydropower. I don't mean nuclear, which is neither clean nor renewable. We have to respect and implement international commitments on biodiversity. We have to look for nature-based solutions. For example, instead of building concrete seawalls, restore mangrove swamps and estuaries. Instead of building dams, allow forests to grow and hold the water. We need to move towards sustainable chemical-free agriculture that no longer poisons the soil. We have to sustain marine ecosystems, prevent ocean pollution, especially plastic and chemical pollution of the ocean, preserve fish stocks. In all countries, we need to adopt strict chemical control policies that require that chemicals be proven safe before they're allowed to enter markets, and do away with the current system in which chemicals are allowed to enter markets with no scrutiny And it takes years then to deal with them if they're found to be harmful. We have to create and expand and safeguard national and international parks on land and marine protected areas in the seas so that there will be pristine areas of the planet for us and for our descendants. We have to support research and monitoring and the building of capacity. We have to educate world leaders and the global public about the importance of biodiversity. And very specifically, we have to educate people about exactly how biodiversity benefits human health, benefits well-being, so that they don't just see biodiversity as something far away and remote, but something that's immediately relevant and beneficial to themselves. And at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge the consequences of failure to take action. So with that, I say thank you, and I remind us all that we are the stewards of this earth. We hold the earth in trust for our children. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil, for sharing with us your perspective. We will come to you very soon for the Q&A.
Thank you.
And your perspective on biodiversity in USA will be really part of the discussion. Allow me to welcome our next panelist, Elvis Paul Tangem. Elvis Paul is going to address land restoration through Africa's Great Green Wall. It's a project proposing the data on the situation on the continent, as well as the national, legal, and one of the institutional protection action as response proposed from the African Union and the region of the Sahel. Elvis Paul, the floor is yours.
The African Union to enhance biodiversity on the continent, and I will use also the example of the Great Green Wall for the Sahara and Sahel to showcase what the African Union is doing. And so before we go on, it is important for us to look at what is biodiversity. I'm sure many of the panelists have defined what biodiversity is, but here it's just good to remind ourselves that biodiversity is a biological variety of life on Earth. Biodiversity is a measure of the variation at the genetic, species, and ecosystem level. As far as Africa is concerned, Africa is very rich in biodiversity. It's home to unique endemic biodiversity. We can look at the statistics. It's about 4,700 mammals, 2,000 species of fish, alongside the 920 amphibians. Biodiversity is very important, very, very important. Important for ecosystem services. Ecosystem services is the basic support system of our life on Earth. Without ecosystem, we will be non-existent. For example, they say, science has proven that if we destroy or we kill all the bees in the world, within a few years, the world would disappear. And nature-based solutions is also dependent on sustainable managed biodiversity. But of late, we have seen that biodiversity is seriously in danger. And some of these dangers or challenges of biodiversity, to sum it up, is caused by land use change and climate change. And it's manifested through challenges like habitat fragmentation, destruction of mangrove, destruction of the ecosystem, land degradation, destruction of coral reef, and which leads to almost complete destruction of the biodiversity. So what is African Union doing? As you well know, African Union's policies and actions are based on the Agenda 2063. Agenda 2063 is the African Indigenous 50 Years Development Plan. And when you look at aspiration 1 of the agenda, it talks about an African sustainable, sane environment. Some of the main activities that the African Union undertakes is provide continental policy coherence, encourage common position in all the 55 member states, policy advocacy, resource mobilization, and ensure that our member states, the 55 member states, have the technical support needed to implement and to enhance biodiversity conservation. And the responsibility at the level of the African Union falls with the Department of Agriculture, Rural Development, Sustainable Environment, and Blue Economy, is in the short form DAB. Key programs here include the CAHOS. This is the Committee of the Heads of State on Climate Change. We have the African Union Sustainable Forest Management Framework. We have the water policy, that's the Kigali Action Plan. We have the Blue Economy Strategy. We have the Environment and Land Management Strategy. We have the Wildlife and Trade in Flora and Fauna. To implement these policies, African Union also has some key initiatives. One among which are the Great Green Wall, the disaster rate reduction, climate change and desertification. And we also have regional offices like SAFCRAT, which is about encouraging the agricultural ecology of the drylands of Africa. And when we talk about the drylands, we're talking about fragile biodiversity, climate change, and landscape. And this map shows us where the drylands of Africa are. Here, we will realize that about 60% of the continent of Africa is dry. And these areas are manifested by vulnerability to extreme weather climate, vulnerability to climate change. And key dryland area in Africa, like what we call the hotspots, are the Sahara region, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and areas around the Kalahari and the Namib region. And here we're talking about areas that constitute more than 50% of our population. And here just trying to show us some of the challenges that is in the drylands, which is about a key among which is precipitation and temperature variability, and what I usually term the caprices of nature, extreme rainfalls, extreme temperature. And it has been shown that if nothing is done in this area, within the next few years, the temperatures in these drylands will go up to 1.5 degrees, meanwhile the global average stands at 1 degree. And so this is just to exemplify, dear colleagues, some of the challenges. And the illustration you see on the right is the Lake Chad region, where you know that the Lake Chad has dropped from 1963 to 2007, more than 94% of its water body. And this one should exemplify the challenges of biodiversity and management on the continent. Because this Lake Chad region was once, as you can see from 1963, how big it was, and it was the mainstay. I mean, it was the main source of livelihood and income generation for over 25 million people. And so the challenges of biodiversity in the drylands has led to what we are seeing here. You can see the stories, I say the stories from the drylands of Africa, extreme weather pattern, land degradation, population growth, failure in subsistence, failures of rangeland and structure. And these photos show all these things that I'm saying about extreme weather climate. You see migration, you see conflict, you see poverty, and civil strife. And all of this is linked to the degrading biodiversity. But this Africa, and especially the drylands, are also areas of serious abundance in ecosystem, rich biodiversity, abundance of energy through different forms of renewables like geothermal, like solar energy, abundance of young population. The youngest population in the world is found in the drylands, especially in the Sahel. And so here I'm talking about what we have been able to do within the framework of the Great Green Wall, which is one of the projects that the African Union is doing on the continent. Here we see millions of hectares of land that have been restored. We've introduced appropriate technology, about 11 million benefited directly. We've undertaken training, promoted value chain. One of the main things that we've done here is mainstreaming of policy and international cooperation to enhance drylands and biodiversity, and to combat the desertification, land degradation, and of course, be resilient to climate change. And to conclude, dear panelists, I'm looking at global issues. It is, as a way of concluding, I'll say we are living in an ecosystem. The world is seriously interconnected between man and nature, interconnected among us. The COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that it had a zoonotic disease, it was a zoonotic disease and came from the origin was linked to biodiversity fragmentation, shows that we have been doing the wrong thing, shows that we need to know that the human health, it leads to the biodiversity and ecosystem health. You cannot separate them. That is why you see the illustration, that's a One Health. And also, Another lesson that we need to look at when we're talking about diversity is we must enhance our diversity to be able to enhance ecosystem services. And ecosystem services is linked to nature-based solutions. And nature-based solutions are the most sustainable solutions to all global human challenges. And so for recommendation, we must enhance international cooperation and investment. We must look at, when we are talking about diversity, we should not look at it from a fragmented approach. We should look at it from a landscape approach. There's an urgent need to implement the multilateral environmental agreements that have been done. Look at the Paris Agreement, where all the promises were done to support adaptation, but so far not much has been done. There's a need for evidence-based engagement, and also to look at the issue of information, and also to push the application of indigenous knowledge in whatever way we are doing. So thank you very much, and I will wait for any questions.
Thank you, Elvis Paul. You remind us how agriculture system and production are of great importance for human health. We create situation of security threat in the world because of self-preservation. People will move elsewhere and try to safeguard their own survival. This is evidence that we need to protect human health while protecting the nature, and also to reverse the damage you have caused. The example of what is ongoing on with the nation in the Sahel, with the leadership of African Union, join what Mary and Phil have already said about the responsibility of governments and regional authorities, and in the biodiversity crisis that is really interlinked with the climate crisis. So your presentation was very informative, and it will feed the discussion that is coming soon after our last, but certainly not least, panelist, Kate Ardiden, who is joining us from Oceania in Australia. Kate, the floor is yours. Please share with us the scale, control, and biological diversity through the experience of the First Nation people.
Maungaya, Baladuwa Rajwi Dumal, Yinangai, Wure, Widyani Nuramangu. Good evening, I'm a proud Wiradjuri woman, but I have never lived on country due to colonisation. I would like to acknowledge the water, soil, skies, plants and animals of my country, and the country on which I live and work, and that sovereignty of these nations and many other First Nations has never been ceded. Country kept my people healthy for millennia, in part through its biodiversity, even as that changed with the climate over that time. As the biological diversity was more recently changed around us by imposed social and environmental colonial laws, we have worked hard to survive and thrive in that changed environment. As the world currently grapples with the anthropogenic climate change and collapse in biological diversity, both driven by the global scale extractive colonial capitalism, I acknowledge the solutions held in the expertise and wisdom of my elders and the elders of other First Nations peoples. Let me be clear that the where in the where part of the solution of this year's theme that I'm referring to other First Nations people of the world. It seems obvious that the problem driving this annual quest for answers to the problem of an unremitting decline in the global biological diversity is the European post-Enlightenment ontology that places humans as dominant over and hyper-separated from nature. What English language calls biodiversity is a critical part of what First Nations peoples call country. First Nations people in Australia believe healthy country, healthy people. Pre-colonisation, biodiversity was vital to the laws, sciences, economies, diplomacy, trade, ceremonies, education and daily lives of First Nations. Biodiversity was part of a common property rights system, and totems continue to be used to represent the relational nature of that overarching structure. You have obligations and responsibilities to your totems. Primarily, one is their ongoing healthy existence. The people you are connected to have totems to which they have obligations and responsibilities. And this web of obligations and responsibilities results in the safeguarding of biodiversity. This collective approach to biodiversity speaks of an ontological acceptance of biodiversity as much more than a public good, as something of its own intrinsic value beyond the judgment of humans. Each Wiradjuri person has 4 totems: group, regional, family and individual. And because colonialism forced my family of country and to disavow their heritage, I do not know my family or personal totem. As such, I am unable to fulfil my custodial obligations and responsibilities to those totems to keep country, and by extension, Wiradjuri people, healthy. And what if you're someone whose totem has been made extinct by the colonial project? Australia's biological diversity was high and highly local. Just in terms of animals, around 93% of the reptiles, 87% of the mammals, including the only 2 egg-laying mammals in the world, and 45% of the bird species here are found only here. Australia is also a major region of subterranean biodiversity, and colonisation changed it all. Australia has one of the worst extinction rates globally. Land clearing and hydrological modification are 2 key factors. The lack of relational accountability in the sciences and policies of colonial institutions is the reason. First Nations peoples are amongst the sickest, most incarcerated and least educated people in Australia, as this slide shows. I don't intend to waste any time recounting the health, legal, education statistics that horrify me. Really, I can't think of a good post-colonisation example where First Nations health, education or legal status, or the biodiversity, aquatic or terrestrial, has not declined in Australia. In this region, you would really have to look into New Zealand for any good examples. In Australia, the Murray-Darling Basin, known as the MDB colloquially, is really quite probably the worst example. And my country, the Wiradjuri Nation, sits squarely in the MDB. The changes to the land and water uses means the conditions of the sites, even their location, particularly in the case of rivers, has altered radically. The consequent water quality and flow regime changes, the introduction of monocultural agricultural practices and other changes, combined with no or deeply restricted access to these sites, means that we can no longer use or care for country in the ways we did and remain obliged to do so. Consequently, social, cultural and economic practices, both public and private, have been destroyed. And then there were those of us who were forced off or forced to choose to move off country into other environmental and social regimes. For Wiradjuri and other First Nation peoples, these were our first anthropogenic climate change experiences. Resistance to the twin decline in biodiversity and First Nations people's health comes in many forms. What they tend to share is an expression of ongoing sovereignty, a nation rebuilding intent, and are embedded in First Nation ontologies. Powerful examples of resistance include declarations and embassies, both standards in international diplomacy. Their use by First Nations peoples should also be seen as diplomatic acts of sovereign states.
And in the biodiversity crisis, that is really interlinked with the climate crisis. So your presentation was very informative, and it will feed the discussion that is coming soon after our last, but certainly not least, panelist, Kate Ardiden, who is joining us from Oceania in Australia. Kate, the floor is yours. Please share with us the scale, control, and biological diversity through the experience of the First Nation people. Kate, we are listening to your presentation.
Marangyaya, Baladuwa Rajri Duamal, Yinangai, Wure, Widyani Nuramangu. Good evening, I'm a proud Wiradjuri woman, but I have never lived on country due to colonisation. I would like to acknowledge the water, soil, skies, plants and animals of my country, and the country on which I live and work and that sovereignty of these nations and many other First Nations has never been ceded. Country kept my people healthy for millennia, in part through its biodiversity, even as that changed with the climate over that time. As the biological diversity was more recently changed around us by imposed social and environmental colonial laws, we have worked hard to survive and thrive in that changed environment. As the world currently grapples with the anthropogenic climate change and collapse in biological diversity, both driven by the global scale extractive colonial capitalism, I acknowledge the solutions held in the expertise and wisdom of my elders and the elders of other First Nations peoples. Let me be clear that the where in the where part of the solution of this year's theme that I'm referring to other First Nations people of the world. It seems obvious that the problem driving this annual quest for answers to the problem of an unremitting decline in the global biological diversity is the European post-Enlightenment ontology that places humans as dominant over and hyper-separated from nature. What English language calls biodiversity is a critical part of what First Nations peoples call country. First Nations people in Australia believe healthy country, healthy people. Pre-colonisation, biodiversity was vital to the laws, sciences, economies, diplomacy, trade, ceremonies, education and daily lives of First Nations. Biodiversity was part of a common property rights system, and totems continue to be used to represent the relational nature of that overarching structure. You have obligations and responsibilities to your totems. Primarily, one is the ongoing healthy existence. The people you are connected to have totems to which they have obligations and responsibilities. And this web of obligations and responsibilities results in the safeguarding of biodiversity. This collective approach to biodiversity speaks of an ontological acceptance of biodiversity as much more than a public good, as something of its own intrinsic value beyond the judgment of humans. Each Wiradjuri person has 4 totems: group, regional, family and individual. And because colonialism forced my family of country and to disavow their heritage, I do not know my family or personal totem. As such, I am unable to fulfil my custodial obligations and responsibilities to those totems to keep country, and by extension, Wiradjuri people, healthy. And what if you're someone whose totem has been made extinct by the colonial project? Australia's biological diversity was high and highly local. Just in terms of animals, around 93% of the reptiles, 87% of the mammals, including the only 2 egg-laying mammals in the world, and 45% of the bird species here are found only here. Australia is also a major region of subterranean biodiversity, and colonisation changed it all. Australia has one of the worst extinction rates globally. Land clearing and hydrological modification are 2 key factors. The lack of relational accountability in the sciences and policies of colonial institutions is the reason. First Nations peoples are amongst the sickest, most incarcerated and least educated people in Australia, as this slide shows. I don't intend to waste any time recounting the health, legal, education statistics that horrify me. Really, I can't think of a good post-colonisation example where First Nations health, education or legal status, or the biodiversity, aquatic or terrestrial, has not declined in Australia. In this region, you would really have to look into New Zealand for any good examples. In Australia, the Murray-Darling Basin, known as the MDB colloquially, is really quite probably the worst example. And my country, the Wiradjuri Nation, sits squarely in the MDB. The changes to the land and water uses means the conditions of the sites, even their location, particularly in the case of rivers, has altered radically. The consequent water quality and flow regime changes, the introduction of monocultural agricultural practices and other changes, combined with no or deeply restricted access to these sites, means that we can no longer use or care for country in the ways we did and remain obliged to do so. Consequently, social, cultural and economic practices, both public and private, have been destroyed. And then there were those of us who were forced off or forced to choose to move off country into other environmental and social regimes. For Wiradjuri and other First Nation peoples, these were our first anthropogenic climate change experiences. Resistance to the twin decline in biodiversity and First Nations people's health comes in many forms. What they tend to share is an expression of ongoing sovereignty and nation rebuilding intent, and are embedded in First Nation ontologies. Powerful examples of resistance include declarations and embassies, both standards in international diplomacy. Their use by First Nations peoples should also be seen as diplomatic acts of sovereign states.
Thank you very much, Kate, for your insight and on how First Nation people are on frontline victims to climate change. And how this is interlinked with social determinant of health and of development, and also in many countries, consequences of the colonialism and how the First Nation is resisting. Thank you to all our panelists for your insightful presentation. I remind all in the audience to send their question through the chat. I have question already, so let's dive into the Q&A session of this webinar. There are great questions already, but also I want to remind everybody that all questions that will be in the chat, will not be answered because of time. Our panelists has committed that they will be answered them in a week and we will share them with you using Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, using the hashtag Ask Professor Agnes. So now the question, Mary, I'm going to ask you the first question. How can women leaders contribute to raising the importance of restoring biodiversity? You have started to tackle on that, but apparently we want more.
Well, I have experience from the climate world that is very relevant. I was shocked when I went to my first climate conference, Copenhagen, in 2009, because it was a very technical, scientific, and frankly, male world. No reference to gender, no reference to human rights. I was really taken aback. The following year in Cancun, the next COP, with Patricia Espinosa, who was the foreign minister of Mexico, and Connie Hedegaard, who had presided over Copenhagen for a while, and Mighty Mashaban, who was going to be in South Africa, we formed a women leaders network on gender and climate. And that allowed us to do two things leading up gradually towards Paris. We were able to influence policy and help to develop a gender action plan. And secondly, and this was really important, we were able to get the right voices to the table. And by the right voices, I mean those who really know what they're talking about. Because many of the delegates live in cities and all they care about is the lines and the text that they're wedded to, the commas. They fight like mad to preserve wording in a text. But when they hear the real impacts of climate from a Constance O'Kellett from Uganda, or from a Hindu Omar Ibrahim from Chad, or from, they really, they kind of stop and listen. And I heard those voices of influence. Another reason why women leaders can do a great deal is because of the trust between women leaders. Trust is in quite short supply, as you would know, Agnes, in our world today, at all levels. But between women leaders, there is a very real listening trust. And usually the group of women leaders is not at one level. It's at various different levels. So there may be top women leaders who've had high level experience, those who are involved in entrepreneurship, industry, whatever, and those who are involved in community leadership, those who are young leaders, etc. And The most recent experience is the one that I mentioned, our new, relatively new Africa, Europe Women Leaders Network. We're able to talk about a whole range of issues that we can really try to work together and problem solve on because of the trust. So I think we have to now gather in our strengths. And one of our strengths is the capacity of women leaders, whether it's on the climate crisis or the biological diversity crisis, and they're two sides of the one coin. We have to work together.
Thank you, Mary. Your experience is really breathtaking, and tell us what to do. And and we have seen that in many areas where women are less competitive and more inclusive. Thanks God, we have a lot of men that are feminist as well. Isn't it, Phil? I'm going to give you the next question, Phil. Tell me, how much death and disease do we lose each year or people we lose each year due to pollution of the environment? And what regions and communities are the most susceptible to be affected by environmental pollution? The floor is yours to answer this question, Phil.
Thank you, Agnes. So pollution, biodiversity loss, climate change, all stem from the same source. They all stem from greed, from short-term thinking, from an obsessive focus on the gross domestic product, a lack of concern for social justice at any level. And all of them are of human origin. All of them threaten human life, human health. They threaten the sustainability of modern societies. Pollution is the piece of this that we've best quantified, and the best estimates we have show that pollution in its many forms, air pollution, water pollution, chemical pollution, kills at least 9 million people per year. 9 million. Hugely unjust in its distribution. 92% of those deaths in low-income countries and middle-income countries, and even in high-income countries, in countries at every level of income, the burden of disease and death that's caused by pollution falls disproportionately upon the poor, minorities, marginalized. It's deeply unjust. We also know, though, from long experience in dealing with pollution, that pollution can be controlled. For example, in the United States, where I have my best data, we have reduced our air pollution by 70%, 70%, since we passed national legislation in 1970. We've reduced our lead pollution by 95%. And those actions have been extremely cost effective. We estimate that every dollar invested in the control of air pollution since 1970 has returned $30 in return in the form of decreased illness, increased productivity, increased creativity of the population. So control of pollution, control of climate change, preservation of biodiversity, these are all places where intelligent, smart, compassionate human action will not only do good, but will also do well, will benefit health, will benefit human well-being, will benefit the economy. Thanks.
Thank you. It is stunning. You have great data that really we need to reflect on. I have a question for you, Kate and Elvis, but before that, I would like to read a comment sent a few minutes ago. Botswana and Namibia are facing destruction of the Okavango Delta and Kavango Basin because of oil and gas exploitation and extraction by Canada and USA. The local people need wealth to develop without destruction of their habitats. How how can a compromise be reached on this? And this is what Mary was talking about, and also Kate. When you face strong people, strong economically, you really need to have support to get out of this mess and this trap. So thank you for sending this comment. And there is also a link for getting more information on the subject. To you, Kate, can you please expand more what it means by First Nation people, what you mean by First Nation people already having experience anthropogenic climate change, when they have experienced that already?
Yep, thanks very much, Professor Agnes.
My name is Agnes as well, if I call you Kate.
I'm sorry?
My name is Agnes also, if I call you Kate.
Manangu, thank you very much.
To give all your title.
Yeah, no, I'm not a big fan of titles. So if you think about the colonial experience, particularly the colonial settled experience, not so much the extractive where you come in and whip out like the example of Botswana and Namibia there that we were just discussing. When the colonialist comes in and stays, we get kicked off our land, we get kicked out of the environment, the biodiversity that we already know, and moved to another. We have to learn a new climate, a new regime, a new set of biodiversity essentially. And that's anthropogenically created in that it's other human beings that have forced us into that situation. So we have to learn new ways to develop an economy around that, like what foods do we eat, what do we trade, what's good for us to eat. That complexity has to be rebuilt in a whole nother environment in a way that was not our choosing. We were forced off country. And so now we're in this situation where we did this in Australia 200 years ago, and still today people are forced off country through this very thing, destruction of large landscapes for extractive industries still. Like just today I was in a lecture where we were talking about people still being herded like cattle off traditional homelands into townships so that a multinational company based in Europe could do hydrological extraction, what's that, fracking. And the same thing's happening today. So these people now have to move to a new environment and learn to live a new way. That's climate change. And now the whole world, particularly the North, industrial North, is upset because climate change has come to them. Like living in your comfortable lounge room, we got moved out of our comfortable lounge room. So this is the second time for us, moved to another lounge room, learnt a new way to live, and now it's come to us again. So I think there's actually already two levels of expertise that could be, if appropriately asked and approached, could be given from Indigenous peoples. The first, how we actually lived with biodiversity, and the second is how we learnt or relearnt to live with new types of biodiversity.
Yeah. It really exemplifies what was said about one of the climate injustice is for minorities and native people, and also the knowledge they have that in protecting biodiversity, they are doing that more than other communities. Thank you.
It's built into the way we think and live. Like the totems example I gave, that's a fundamental social, economic, scientific, like every aspect of broadly defined culture is embedded in that totem system, and it underpins biodiversity.
Yeah. Elvis Paul, I have a question for you here. What could be important consideration for the private and public sector and allied movement to consider in addressing and helping mitigate inequities faced by communities who suffer from biodiversity loss?
Thank you very much, Agnes. First of all, let me say happy Africa Day. You know, today is the Africa Day. So Let me wish all of you happy Africa Day. And to say, Agnes, there was a very strong statement that somebody made in one of our meetings. The person said, the opposite of poverty is not riches. The opposite of poverty is justice. And that was really strong, really super strong, that the opposite of poverty is justice. And I think that goes to say exactly to what, if I may, Your Excellency Robinson, call you Mary, and what Kate is saying, and exactly what Philip is saying.
Yeah.
We can not go on like this. It's just like what the brother from Namibia is saying, the issue of the Kavungo River, where the communities are being chased out without any due consideration, without alternatives, and with promises that will never be fulfilled. And that is what we're saying. Agnes, we are all here in Kigali, and you are here at the hotel. You are feeling the tremors of the eruption of the mountain in Goma. And when you look at the images, you see how families have been abandoned to themselves, and this lava is just eating up life investment. So if you ask me what can be done about such things, I think we from the African Union, there are a lot of frameworks that have been set out to take care of this issue. There's a lot of policies, and our government has signed so many multilateral environmental agreements and agreements on the right of the people, that the issue is implementation. For any real investment to go in, as you know very well, there are laws, national laws, even local laws that says you must do an environmental and social impact assessment and put in place alternatives before you engage in any activities, both economic and environmental, that will have impact on the local people. The issue is it's never followed. The private sector, which are really big in the challenges that we are talking about, I don't know whether they are culprits, they are victims of systems that exist, that either they are corrupted or they get involved in corruption. So much so that at the end of the day, even the resources that were supposed to put together to be able to obey what the laws are saying is not done. So if you ask me what can we do, first of all, Agnes, let's just let the private sector and the public sector actors just follow the rules. We have the best rules in Africa. We have done everything. If you come to the African Union, we have thousands and thousands of our member states have signed so many of these rules, so many of these documents, so many, but nobody really takes time to look at it and to follow. And also the community, the victims are also, most of the time, ignorance of their rights. And so there's a huge need for us to educate our communities about their right to their resources. And Kate is talking about the displacement of the indigenous people. It is something that is recurrent. It's every day. You know that very well. It's every day in Africa. And irrespective of what we do at the level of the African Union, trying to engage with investors, with our government, but the issue of corruption, the issue of nepotism, there's a lot of issues that are around it that we cannot have time to talk about. But the bottom of all is that let's just follow the rules. Let the community look at what they have that is protecting them. Let the private sector follow what has been written. Let the government, the national government, hold these private sectors into ransom to ask them, what have you done? And let them be some inclusive way of doing it. It shouldn't be left in the hands of politicians. It should be inclusive, because politicians are also super influenced by other externalities that I think Mary Robinson knows very well. You know, and all of us, we know how difficult is it to implement policies. So it will take all of us, it takes all the actors to be able to ensure that these challenges faced by communities, by indigenous people, by First Nation people can be solved, and it should be solved. If not, if we just say investment, like Philip was saying, we want to invest, we want to see industries, we want to see, and the whole ecosystem is destroyed. Just look at the Sahel, what is happening. Just this week, you saw how many young people died trying to cross from Morocco to Spain. We cannot count how many corpses. I go to the Sahel. You cannot count how many corpses of young people. And studies have shown that most of these young people are coming from the dry lands. They are coming from areas that have been sent away because of mining, because of petrol, because of everything. And they are just going into the wilderness. They prefer to die, you know, than to stay and not be useful to their communities. So you talk about spiritual aspect, you talk about economic aspect, you talk about our cultural norms. This is all linked to biodiversity. So there is a lot that we can talk about, but let those people, or let the private sector, let the public sector just follow the rules, because everything has been written and everything is there. Yeah.
So I think it's not the good verb, my friend Elvis Paul. It's not let them, it's find a way to oblige them to. Because all what you say, it's a matter of accountability. When there is more people dying due to climate change and biodiversity and the consequence on families and communities than by dictatorship in our continent. And for dictatorship, killing people, the world has managed to put something in place called international tribunals. So justice, we should find a way for climate justice to make people accountable as well. Phaedra, there is a question about what is the role of education in protecting biodiversity and response to all those issues raised by Mary, Kate, Phil, and Elvis Paul.
Thank you, Prof. Agnes, and thanks all to the panelists so far. So we're seeing right now that the links between human, animal, and environmental health are becoming more pronounced. And so there's a significant and timely need for a new approach to health problems. And this widening responsibility for health across disciplines brings with it the recognition that an important transformation for our upcoming workforce is required in attitudes and practices. We also see that current education, particularly health education, is disconnected from the reality on the ground. Health must now be the purview of many professionals, and this is the role education can play. Incorporating a One Health approach in education at different levels is critical to give students the skills and the values needed to preserve our environment and protect our biodiversity and ensure health for all. So as I mentioned in my introduction, the One Health approach recognizes the links between humans, animals, and their shared environment. It differs from other approaches to health as it considers the integrative efforts of multiple disciplines and sectors working locally, nationally, and globally to achieve evidence-based and community-based solutions to complex health challenges like the loss of biodiversity. The One Health approach takes different disciplinary strengths and their best practices and compels them to work together. So at the University of Global Health Equity, we have a unique focus on One Health and on practical experiences outside of the classroom so that students can understand the complexity of ensuring health in all settings. So we integrate this One Health approach across all of our programs, including right now in global health delivery and medicine. and future programming in nursing, gender, and research. Students at UGEG also live and work close to the real world experiences of some of the world's most vulnerable and marginalized communities, those who have been the most impacted by the loss of biodiversity and climate change. Our students learn firsthand from experienced implementers and policymakers, including community health workers in rural villages. So as an example, in our medical program, future doctors take an Introduction to One Health module, where they learn about case studies showing how our changing environment impacts health and the role them as a physician can take. Future doctors also go on site visits, such as to a pig farm, where they observe the direct interactions between the farmers, the pigs, and the environmental setting that the farm is located in. So we're seeing that global challenges that we're talking about, like climate change, the loss of biodiversity, now with COVID-19, and their drivers and impacts are one where many professionals are undertrained. So we're at the Center for One Health are filling this gap through One Health programs for all of our students, whether they're in medicine, nursing, or health delivery, in order to gain these important competencies for life in the 21st century. We're calling on more institutions across disciplines and across programs to use One Health in its curriculum.
Thank you, Phaedra. So it's a call for multidisciplinary approach to health education and also program. It should be everywhere, in economy, in history, in sociology, in everything, in agriculture, everything. We should have educating people on the health where we are living, because their health will be in threat. Agree with you. Mary, there is a question about the annual United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that it's held by the United Nations. This year, we will have the 26th Convention on Climate Change. And could you explain why it's important to have indigenous and grassroots voices at the table of that Convention on Climate Change, and what we can do to give them a voice? Because Kate says people are displaced in Australia and they even don't know they can say no. And we have the same in Namibia, we have the same in Angola, and we have the same in the native nation in the US.
Okay, Agnes, first of all, I agree with the One Health approach, just to put that on the record. I think it's the right approach, absolutely. And it could apply, as Phaedra said, across the board in education, and I hope it will. But to your point about, COP26, I mean, it's no exaggeration to say this could be the most important year of humanity, because it's the year when we have the two big conferences. We have the conference in Kunming in October, COP15 on biological diversity, and then we have the COP in Glasgow in November, COP26 on climate. And we have to really bend the curve on emissions, and we have to really address the restoration and the conservation and the protection of biodiversity. And we're not on course. That's the value of one set of voices, the young climate activists. They keep calling us out because they're reading the science. That's the great thing about them. They're not using emotional language for the sake of it. They're actually just saying, listen to the science, you're not there, you're not there. And they're absolutely right. So why is it important to have indigenous and community grassroots voices on marginalized and gender issues? Because these are the voices of urgency. And I saw that again. I saw the example in the climate conference, Paris. I was the special envoy of the Secretary General, as I mentioned. I witnessed what happened on the road to Paris very clearly. The French presidency kept having more and more informal ministerial meetings. We knew we'd get an agreement when President Obama and President Xi said, the United States and China want a Paris Agreement. The question is, what kind of agreement? And I'll tell you why it's so important. We then had the pressure in those informal meetings, in particular of Tony de Bruym, the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands. He kept saying, do you want my people to no longer be a sovereign nation? Do you want my island to go under? Do you want us to no longer be a people in a formal sense? And it got into the ear of those listening. So at Paris, a high ambition coalition was formed, led by Tony de Bruym of the Marshall Islands, but including the United States and the European Union. And the main focus of that was to get 1.5 into the text. And we got a new goal in Paris, as we know, to stay well below 2 degrees and work for 1.5 degrees. The scientists had never studied that. They'd actually given up on 1.5 degrees, more or less. So the Paris Agreement had to ask the scientists, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, please tell us what's the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, and how do we, if we have to, stay at 1.5 degrees. And in that report that I referenced briefly earlier, that agreement in October 2018, probably the most important report of the IPCC, the special report on 1.5 degrees warming, they said very clearly, there is a very big difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. In that band of time, bad things will probably happen. The Arctic ice may well disappear. The coral reefs will probably disappear. And the permafrost will melt hugely and throw up not just carbon, but methane, which in the short term is even more lethal. So the whole world has to stay at 1.5 degrees. So thank you to the indigenous peoples and the small island states and the poorest countries and civil society that managed to get that into the text, or we would never have had that report. We would never have really understood where we are. We're not doing enough about it, but at least we understand where we are. We need the same urgency in COP26 now to deliver. Yes, countries and corporations and cities are committing to the long-term goal of being zero emissions by 2050, net zero emissions. 2050 is a little bit away. 2030 is much closer. We need the commitments for 2030, 2025, 2023, 2022 now. We need the nationally determined contributions, and we need them to be very specific. And we need the investment to be very specific as shifting away. And we saw it a little bit. For the first time, the G7 of environmental ministers aligned themselves to the 1.5 degrees. That's actually quite significant. We're seeing the International Energy Agency in its recent report aligning itself to the 1.5 degrees. Very important. We're seeing investors aligning themselves. It's beginning to happen. But without the voices of those most affected, most authoritative, most knowledgeable about the existential threat, most urgent, we won't get the kind of real transformation that we still haven't got and desperately need.
Thank you, Mary. It is important to follow. We learned that it's important to follow the global awareness and advocacy to join our voice timely, but also to give space to indigenous and grassroots voice, as they are the first on line of vulnerability and have a lot to teach us. Phil, I have a question for you. What are some of the specific harms to human health that result from degradation of ocean? And before you answer, I want to remind everybody that all the questions that you will put in the Q&A will be answered within a week by the panelists to whom they are addressed. Phil, could you answer that question?
Sure. It's so important to talk about that. Before I answer this specific question, I want to go back to a bigger point. And the bigger point is that it's so important to bring health into all these conversations. You know, I've been to climate change meetings where the climate scientists are presenting elegant data on molecules dancing in the upper atmosphere. It's brilliant stuff, and it's about as relevant to day-to-day life as an iceberg is in my backyard. You have to bring it back to health. And one of my concerns actually about the agenda for COP26 is that there's very little in there on the health consequences of climate change. And there's a group of us who are working already towards COP27 in Africa next year to try to make health more of a centerpiece. Because if we don't make the discussions of climate change relevant to human health, relevant to women's health, relevant to children's health, relevant to the health of indigenous people, it's just abstract and it's too easy for people to ignore it. So coming back to your specific question, how does pollution of the oceans come back to human health? Well, it comes back in several ways, mostly through seafood. So mercury is a big problem in the oceans, and there are two main sources of mercury. One is the burning of coal. All coal contains mercury. When you burn coal, mercury vaporizes, goes up into the atmosphere, and eventually comes down into the sea. The other source is small-scale gold mining, which uses mercury in the process, and that mercury gets loose and ends up in the ocean. So when mercury gets into the ocean, it transforms itself into a very toxic form of mercury called methylmercury. That type of mercury moves up through the food chain. It accumulates to very high levels in fish like tuna, swordfish, striped bass, other top predator species at the top of the food chain. And when we humans eat those fish, that mercury comes into us. It's especially dangerous if a pregnant woman eats it, or a woman who's soon to become pregnant, because that mercury gets into her body and can then poison the brain of her child before the child is even born. Another really nasty chemical in the oceans are the persistent organic pollutants, DDT, PCBs, the other POPs. They too move up through the food chain. They too accumulate in the fish, and they too can cause brain damage if a woman eats it before her child is born. Plastic pollution. Something like 10 or 12 million tons of plastic, mostly single-use plastic, ends up in the oceans every year. Plastic is bad enough itself. It strangles seabirds. It gets into the stomachs of whales and fish. But perhaps even more dangerous and more insidious than the visible plastic are the toxic chemicals in the plastic. So think of pretty much any plastic product you hold in your hand in your house. In that plastic are plasticizers like phthalates and bisphenol A, which are endocrine disruptors, are brominated flame retardants, which are neurotoxic, other chemicals which are toxic to reproduction. All of those chemicals are embedded in the plastic. When the plastic gets into the ocean, it breaks down into microplastic particles that contain all of these chemicals. They're like little Trojan horses. All of these nasty little people are inside the plastic particles. Those plastic particles get into the food chain. And when we enjoy a nice piece of tuna or an oyster at the seashore or something like that, we're not just eating tuna or an oyster, we're eating plastic, and we're eating all the nasty chemicals that are in the plastic. So those are anything that we put into the environment ends up in the oceans. The oceans are the ultimate sink of all pollution. And when we eat seafood, which more than a third of the world's population does on a regular basis, we poison ourselves. So it's just one more way of thinking about the circle of life, the interconnections between the preservation of biodiversity, ending pollution, keeping every human physically healthy and mentally well. It all goes together. It all speaks to the need to fundamentally reform the way we think about humanity's relationship to the environment.
Thank you, Phil. It's quite scaring what we are eating when we eat something that is so good as a fish. And we need to say that there are some people who have the choice, but there are people living in the coast who have no other choice than to
No
be
choice
poisoned.
whatsoever. No, the ocean is their kitchen, and if we poison the ocean, they're
Absolutely.
eating poison food every day.
You poison their cupboards and their storage of food. So, Elvis Paul, could you answer this question? What key factors must be taken in account when transforming and restoring African countries' land and agroecological systems?
Thank you very much, Agnes. What are the key factors to consider during restoration or during transformation? I think the truth is, if you look at the challenges of climate change, land degradation, desertification, and all the challenges of biodiversity loss. These challenges are what we term wicked problems. That is, they are so intermingled and they are so difficult, not difficult in the sense of what we can do, but you have to be very careful, because when you want to solve one of these problems, there is an unintended impact that can lead to, that can negatively affect another aspect of life. So the first thing, Prof, that we need to take into consideration, the first factor is that these things cannot be done in isolation. You cannot balkanize them as we see in our governments, where you have the Minister of Environment, Minister of Health, Minister of Forestry, Minister of Wildlife, Minister of Mining. This balkanization of our governance system is one of the biggest problems that we have in the world, where people are pulling resources for doing the same thing. What the Ministry of Environment is doing is exactly what the Ministry of Health should be doing, and is exactly what the Ministry in charge of Energy and Mines should be doing. So the first factor is that we need to consider this from what we call a landscape base. It should be an integrated system. If we want to succeed in whether we are combating climate change, we are combating air pollution, ocean pollution, you cannot do it in isolation and in balkanized mode, no. So the first factor is an integrated, systemic, synergized, coordinated approach. That is the only approach that can work. The second aspect is it should be inclusive. And when we are talking about inclusivity, we must bring together all the stakeholders. And bringing together women, indigenous people, arguing that this is not affirmative action. Because for a long time, people thought, I don't know how it came about when we were children, we thought environmental protection was affirmative action. No, it makes business sense. It's like the issue of gender. You cannot exclude more than 50% of the population from decision-making, from policy, from economic, and then you say you want to solve global issues. So inclusivity is sine qua non condition for these things to be done appropriately, which means the general population, the youth, the women, the children, the men, people living in the cities, private sector, government sector, everybody, it must be inclusive, as big as possible. Everybody has a part to play, irrespective of where you are, irrespective of your level of interaction. That is the second aspect of what should be done. The other aspect, which is recent, is that we should recognize the power of technology, social media, and the current what we call the fourth industrial revolution. These are powerful tools. Look at where we are. We are talking from all over the world, talking together as if I'm saying Phil in the US, Mary in wherever, you know. So these are powerful tools that unfortunately many governments, even in the most developed economy, have not been able to leverage and to put into our current governance system. People are still struggling, and understandably so, because the things are moving so fast that we can't catch up. Just take, for instance, the importance of the drones. Drones are the newest technology, but already look at the impact of drones in the domain of land restoration, earth observation, monitoring. Even planting of seeds and trees now are done by drones. In health, we see here in Rwanda, where they started with drones carrying essential medical equipment and blood to other parts, to difficult areas that have difficult access. So technology information and communication is very, very necessary, and we need to capture that at an official level, because in most African countries, these things are still considered informal sector. In many African countries, there are no laws on this. And so there is a lot of things that we could be doing right, that we are trying to do, but a lot needs to be done, especially at the level of governance. And the last aspect that I want to talk on is this interaction, or what they call the need for interaction between policymakers, between research, between development practitioners. There's still a very huge gap between key actors. The interface between policy, research, development, private sector is still not existing, especially talking in the area of climate, in the area of biodiversity, sustainability, in the area of what I'm doing, what we call sustainable land management and restoration of drylands. These people are still not talking together. Irrespective, it is so difficult to get the private sector to come into important discussion with those who are involved in restoration. And we have to acknowledge that yesteryears, we did a very bad job at selling restoration and environmental actions. For instance, Agnes, when you look at the agricultural sector, when you come to the Africa Union during huge meetings like the Heads of State Summit, you find big agricultural lobbies going around with files, talking with, lobbying the heads of state for fertilizers, for agricultural input. But when you look at the environment sector, you see some old people going around with placards. And so the environmental sector has always remained like affirmative action. It's like Greenpeace kind of thing. No, restoration makes sense. It's huge business.
Yes.
Investment in restoration, investment in green, in blue economy. If you look at the importance, the important investment in just for instance, in renewable energy, it's a huge sector. Investment in forestry is a huge sector. Carbon sequestration is a huge sector for investment. So there is a lot of things that we can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elvis Paul. Kate, a quick question for you, because we are getting at the end of this interesting discussion. Tell me, what is in the ontology ways to know of indigenous people that can give them a particular role or advantage to develop or contributing to lasting solutions?
Thanks, Agnes. I'm actually pretty good at the quick answer.
Yes.
My answer is actually pretty simple. I think that relational accountability is a good solution, or it's a part of the solution, and in many ways it wraps up quite nicely all the things that all the speakers have mentioned tonight. It comes really beautifully to Mary's point about women in leadership and the trust that women in leadership often have. You can't, relational accountability, whether you're a policymaker or a researcher, is really about how you go about engaging in the work that you do. Why are you doing it? Is it a good reason? Are the outcomes appropriate? Like, it's not a box ticking exercise. It's there's a purpose behind it. You're answering to the relationships that you have across the board. So in terms of policy, you're not looking just at what the funder wants or just what the big stakeholders want. It's what every single being related benefits from. So it's the fish at the top of the food chain that Phil was talking about, it's every single component of the system how you relate to that and how you fulfill your obligations to that responsibility. It's a really big issue, you know, and you don't, if you think about things from a relational accountability perspective, you don't actually, if you're the person in the city squabbling over the comma in the paragraph, because I've been in those positions as a low-level public servant, the pre-conference debate that goes on, and you're sitting there and you're watching your boss and you're going, I don't care if there's an apostrophe between that T and that S or not. It really doesn't make any difference. The substantive thing is this going to make things better for people or not? If you trust, you don't need to be, you know that there's someone's going to be better off. You don't need to go to meet that person in Bengal to know that that T doesn't matter whether it's crossed through or not. If you have a sense of an accountability to the relationships between you as one human being then and them as another, you write better policy, you do better research. Relational accountability would be my answer.
Thank you, Kate. You were short, fast.
Yes.
We are now at the end of this webinar. Thank you all our speakers and our audience for attending this very interesting conversation and for using this platform to contribute to raise global awareness. And we have all benefit from you, all the speakers, with new knowledge that we have gained. We must all understand that to follow your guidance, the world needs to rethink the consumption and the use of data to measure the impact of production and consumption geographically and create a global monitoring and evaluation system that is transparent if we want to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. And this is exactly what you have all said. So far, monitoring and evaluation network are not collaborating across the world and are not reinforced. Although without having good data, we have no reason to delay the urgent action that we need to take today to halt biodiversity decline, and also to disseminate the success of various interventions, all done together, that include private sector, civil society, government, indigenous group, and also the scientific community. As an university, we train our students, as Phaedra have told you, to be good fighters in the field by providing interdisciplinary education focused on equity, innovation, implementation, and biosocial science to make them future experts and change makers capable of facing unexpected challenge threat. Equity is the driving force of UJG, and it is critical to bring together experts and change makers who champion sustainability for our planet during this challenging time based on equity. Thank you, dear friends, Mary, Phil, Kate, and Vispol, and also thank you to the Center of One Health for hosting us. And if you want to be in touch with Dr. Phaedra Ale, the chair of the center, please consult our UJG website. The webinar is recording and it will be disseminated on the UJG channel shortly. All your questions will be responded using the hashtag Ask Professor Agnes on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. This session is closed, and I wish all of you a good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, and look forward to seeing you again to the next month's Ask Professor Agnes Equity webinar. Thank you all for your attendance. Thank you, Phil, Mary, Kate, Elvis, Phaedra, and also thank you to the communication team that has made this possible, and to Brianna that has helped us to put all this together. Bye, everybody, and thank you.